In this module, we're going to begin to dig into this idea of cross-cultural negotiation. I say begin because there are so many countries, and even within countries, there are cultures and subcultures, and there are layers of culture and other forms of diversity, just as you will notice in generation and gender, and when you start to try to unpack it all, there's just so much to talk about. However, we are going to delve into some frameworks that help us understand the elements of culture that do affect negotiation. So that gives you two important pieces of information. One, what is typical for me and someone like me from this culture that I represent? And secondly, what is typical of someone else coming from or negotiating in another country? So we'll talk more about that momentarily, but let me first kind of set the stage for what this module is going to consist of. First of all, there is a chapter from my text that I would love for you to read or at least skim heavily. And the slides that follow kind of talk about key points in the chapter, as well as some other elements that are brought in. The negotiation that is going to occur within this module is based on the case study that is available on Canvas called The Case of the Floundering Expatriate. And by the term floundering, this is a person who is sent abroad by his company and he's not doing very well. And so as you read the story on Canvas, you'll get a sense for how Bert came to have this position, what's going on, what is the goal for his position, and where are the potential problems in how he's going about enacting his role. Now, in this particular negotiation, unlike the other two, we are going to negotiate in small groups, as small as 2, as large as 3. And the way I've set this up is each one of you will be in a group of 2 to 3. And you will either play the role of Bill Luan, who is the American CEO of Argos International. And as you'll see in the next slide, you have an issue with sort of the feedback that you're getting right now about Bert's performance as it relates to Frank Waterhouse, to whom Bert reports in Europe. And so Frank does report to Bill, but both men have consequential positions in the Argos organization. One is Argos full stop, and the other is Argos Europe. And so by having this set up, what we're doing is each one of you is playing the role of either Frank and ideas that Frank has for addressing the Bert Donaldson problem, or Bill and his ideas on addressing the Bert Donaldson problem. And each one of you is joined by a consultant or two who is an expert in all things cross-cultural negotiation. Now, where does that expertise come from? Of course, part of it is what you know from your experience, but also the readings and the slides that you will have had the chance to look at. But in addition, there is a separate document uploaded on Canvas that is commentaries written by professionals who are well-versed in cross-cultural negotiation, professors, experts, consultants, etc. And so if your name is not listed in bold in this grid, you are to play the role of a consultant to either Frank or Bill, and you build on the ideas from the commentaries that you read, either Doug, Fons, or Bjorn on the Frank side, and Roman and Susan on the Bill side. And that, is pretty specific, but honestly, I want you to take a position about the situation from your perspective add to it from the perspective of the consultants and their commentaries, and add to that what you understand about the challenges of working and negotiating abroad. So we will have this negotiation live in Seattle on May 13th. And so it would be a very good idea to get together with your groups to begin to strategize how you're going to go about this negotiation. Now, there's some basic strategizing, which is as you have in the past. What is my goal? Why is it important? What are my interests? What's my partner? What does the other person or group likely want? What questions will I ask, etc. But there's a little bit more to the strategy outline this time, also representing the greater complexity. So that's one thing you have to work out, but you also have to work out how are the 2 or 3 of you going to engage in this negotiation? Is Frank taking the lead and let's say that's Craig, and Jill just kind of chimes in when she needs to? Is it kind of a 50-50 united front? You kind of represent the Frank side? There's no right answer, but this is something that you should discuss, because if you think about it, as difficult as it is when there's only 2 people in negotiation who are vying for airtime, you add a 3rd or a 4th or a 6th person, it becomes even more challenging to navigate this complex conversation. So please spend a little time thinking about how you're going to team up in this negotiation, which will last about 45 minutes, as well as what are your key goals and interests in the negotiation, and how will you find that sweet spot of overlapping interests during the negotiation. So as I said, the case study you should start with, read the story of how Bert Donaldson came to be in a, let's just say, pickle in his role in Argos Europe. So what caused this problem, etc. Now, as you can see from this write-up, Bill is starting to hear some information that things are not going as well as Bill had expected. Bill sent Frank his golden boy, Bert, and word on the street is that Bert's not only not doing particularly well in the goals that have been set for him, but he's kind of pissing some people off. So Bill is interested in finding out who is to blame for the problems, but more importantly, I hope, what could be done to address this issue and get Bert back on track. Now, Bill is bringing a couple, 1 or 2 cross-cultural business experts, but Frank decides that he doesn't want to be outnumbered or outpowered in the meeting, and he does the same. Perhaps from his perspective, these consultants can help Bill understand what's going on with Donaldson and why perhaps his selection for this position was not ideal. And let's assume that all parties have read some on the topic of cross-cultural or international negotiations. So both men have invested interest in addressing this problem. The question is how. And I will say, and as it does say in this document, that indeed, not unlike the power screen situation vis-a-vis HackerStar as a company, there's a similar thread here. There's the Bert Donaldson issue, but there may also be a more systemic issue about how people are selected within the organization and sent abroad as expatriates. How are they onboarded? How are they repatriated? Could they have done more? And if so, if you don't address this larger systemic problem, if Bert were to come home, and perhaps that might be the solution that you all come up with, what will keep the next Argos person sent abroad from floundering? How will you address that? So, as usual, recognize that the commentaries and even what you read about Bill and Frank to be as starting points. You don't need to be super stubborn or super confrontational, but there are positions to start with. And my goal for you is to start there, but then use your skills, use your strategy to be effective in trying to reach an integrative win-win solution.
So broadly speaking, as you have seen in our past conversations and negotiations, what makes us different could potentially make negotiating with this other person difficult. And it may be as simple as our speech patterns, which are affected by gender, for example, but they're also affected by culture. So, for example, on this list, communication style, there's direct and indirect. Now, I think those terms are pretty clear and straightforward. However, I will say that we also talk about high context and low context. And what that means is in a high context culture, like Chinese culture, for example, it is important to read the nonverbal cues to understand what's being said, that more of the message is being transmitted through nonverbal mechanisms and the setting than is the case in a more direct or low context culture. The nature of agreements. This one I think is also quite wide-ranging with regard to various cultures. In some cultures where the relationship and building that relationship and trust is so important, the nature of the relationship dictates that the actual contract or written agreement might be very short, very general, that company A agrees to work with company B to produce item X. And that may be all that is necessary. And as you can imagine, that for those of you who've spent some time in the US, that's really not the case in the US. We like our specific agreements. We like, putting 17 pages worth of legalese that could specify every possible outcome and the rules within each of these outcomes prior to even moving forward in this negotiation. So it's related to the contract, but it's also related to the nature of the agreement. So having a general meeting of the minds is one kind of end of the range, but the other is let's kind of talk through and hash out all the potential details. We've talked a lot about distributive and integrative negotiation, of course, but some cultures tend to be more integrative by nature. And not always, but sometimes that lines up with the collectivistic cultures. And by definition, when it's a matter of what's good for all of us, there is more attention paid to what does each of us want, and is there a way that we can integrate and involve these things. There's also a connection between this and the feminine masculine dimension of Hofstede, which we'll talk about in a bit. So this idea of having an attitude of being either, really my way or the highway, this is a fixed pie, and if I yell and shout, I will get the bigger part of the pie. That is not just an individual consideration, it's also something that is impacted by one's culture. I think formal and informal is something that's pretty noticeable. I mean, certainly in a business setting, maybe less so in a flea market or souk context, but you probably will have seen in some cultures, like German culture, tends to be far more formal. Formal with titles, formal with dress, formal with communication, whereas on average, Americans tend to be a bit more informal on these same dimensions. And so this does not mean that one is right or one is wrong, but when members of two very different cultures on these scales come together, the way in which personal style appears could feel disrespectful. So the person, and certainly this was the case with Bert Donaldson, um, those who are more formal, kind of like Germans, Swiss, etc., are expecting a certain demeanor and code of dress. And when Bert Donaldson shows up with his Mickey Mouse sweatshirt, there are some problems. So, again, these different factors that present themselves in a negotiation are things that could affect the negotiation, affect the interpretation of individuals' behaviors, and therefore affect the relationship as well as the outcome. And so, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but you should know that where you are on these ranges, which may well have been informed by the culture to which you belong and or live in currently, what you're used to may be very different from what someone else is used to, and therefore could be a source of immediate conflict as a negotiation begins. So there have been a lot of theorists and practitioners who have looked at culture in a way of providing some kind of a framework to help individuals see and connect with how what they do and what they know and how they respond and what they value compares and contrasts with that in other cultures. And these 5 dimensions, which are written about in the text, I'm going to elaborate on now. This one, I think, is one that many of us are quite familiar with, whether it's the terms that are being used or just the idea. But individualism and collectivism is the degree to which members of the society or members on a team within a company will act either as members of a larger group or collective, or as individuals who, while I may be in this group or in this organization, it's all about me. So I'll start there. Americans in particular are highly individualistic. It is all about me. Look at me, look at what I've accomplished, aren't I wonderful? And not only that, there's a bit of hedonism revolving around this idea, like how can I make myself feel better? What do I like? How do I improve myself? And I really resent and resist somebody else telling me what to do or what decision I should make. It's about autonomy. And again, while these are examples of societies, number one, they don't explain the entirety of all societies. These are just examples. And number two, even more important, not everyone in the country named subscribes to these cultures in the way I've described. Just like you can't say all Americans X, you can't say all Australians Y either, right? So we have, for example, Americans within the US who, because of their background or because of their cultural heritage, may be well more collectivistic than some of the most individuals who live in and work in South Korea. So it's, you have to kind of recognize that these are generalizations which are helpful and they're a good starting point, but individuals obviously do not necessarily represent carbon copies of all the individuals of a society. Collectivists are the opposite. It's all about loyalty to the group, loyalty to the team, what's in the best interest of the group and the team, how can we maintain our harmony and be cohesive, sometimes to the detriment of dealing with conflict and opinions that may be helpful but run counter to kind of the consensus of the group. It's all about collaboration, and especially in the case of Japan, for example, it's collaborative decision making, but there is also an influence of hierarchy. So if everyone who is on the team is at the same organizational level, it's about not deciding on the spot if there's a need for more time to have this conversation within the group. And especially if there is a power difference, it's collaboration but deference to somebody who is higher in the hierarchy. Well, I just kind of teed up this idea of hierarchy. Well, power distance is the degree to which members in a society or a culture defer to, and therefore, in a sense, give greater distance with those in power. So where the power distance is high, there's great respect for titles, great respect for age and seniority, and because of that, individuals are going to adhere to the process and the protocol as specified. And there's this kind of paternalistic, child parent, those who are lower in the hierarchy will defer and allow for somebody else to give the ruling or make the decision or speak for them. And so you can imagine how talking from if you're someone coming from a low power distance culture where it's all egalitarian, we're all kind of on the same page, we're empowered, we might ask a direct question to somebody in the room who comes from a culture of high power distance, and when they say, I can't answer that, the low power distance person might say, why, don't you know? But that's not necessarily the answer or the reason. It's, I know, perhaps, but it's not for me to decide. It's for us to collaborate and get back to you. So, sorry, now I'm mixing up a little bit the collectivism, but it's for somebody who is in a higher power distance to speak on that topic if there is somebody with greater power or title in the group. One other thing that I would mention, a little story about how this manifests itself, about the respect for age and titles. In fact, in the US, it's a little bit the opposite of that, right? Leave your title at the door, or, well, just because you're the boss, I'm going to challenge you. Well, some years ago when I was living in Los Angeles, I was waiting in a queue at the post office, and as I'm waiting there, it was a long line. It was around, the Christmas holidays, and so lots of customers queued up. And there was this queue of which I was a part, and then separate there was a man with his back to the line at a table, possibly addressing a package. And it was an elderly man of Asian heritage. And in one moment, it's kind of a strange story to tell, in one moment, the man loudly farted. And a little boy, 5 or 6 years old, who was there at the time close to the man, looked at him, pointed at the man, and said, "Uh-oh!" And I myself, standing in the line at the time, I was like, wow, that's interesting. It was as if there was no attempt made whatsoever to try to cover or reduce the sound of this body function. And yet, personally, I was like, gosh, I would be mortified. I would never do this. I would excuse myself from the room, etc., etc. That's me, Suzanne. But I talked to a friend of mine about this situation, and she was Asian American, and she, without skipping a beat, said very simply, I described the person, and she said, as somebody of Korean heritage, and again, not all Asians are the same, but in much of Asian cultures, respect for age is so great that when you grow to be a certain age, you are afforded that luxury of being able to say or do whatever you want and nobody will judge you. It's like you have earned the right to do that, and you can do that with impunity. And so, sorry about the weird and perhaps a little off-color story, but I think it really does illustrate to some degree this power distance difference. So masculinity and femininity are terms in some ways I kind of wish Hofstede didn't use, because they're a little misleading, they're a little confusing. It's not about feminine behavior per se as we've defined it earlier in class, or masculine behavior, but it's, as he defined it, kind of what appeared to be, at the time he coined these terms, behaviors that suggested more alignment with women's values versus those aligned with more men's values. So feminine countries, of which Sweden and Norway are excellent examples, this idea that you are supportive and compassionate and caring is kind of a natural way of behaving. And interestingly, women and men in the most feminine of countries demonstrate these values. So it might, again, be confusing to someone from a more masculine country to see men and women in this very compassionate, collaborative, democratic, supportive, empathetic sort of way, thinking, gosh, what's wrong with these men? Why aren't they more like us? I think feminine behavior is less different across these feminine and masculine countries, but masculine behavior is more different. And so, again, these masculine or feminine characteristics are what make up this dimension of prevailing behaviors and how they tend to look more masculine or feminine. You can imagine how that would show up in a negotiation, right? It may be more competitiveness, more distributiveness. It could be, all right, great, got your name, got your title, let's just jump in and let's get this over with. Whereas there would be, in feminine countries, more natural focus on building the relationship, building trust, building compassion. Uncertainty and avoidance is, well, exactly as it sounds. Again, there are individual differences that would seem to negate at times where a person comes from, but there is evidence that cultures also display these differences pretty significantly. And so where there is a culture of avoiding uncertainty, like there is in Greece and Guatemala, for example, the way that manifests itself in a negotiation might be, say, for example, a member of a team would be talking about, oh, well, I mean, we know what we mean by that. Let's just keep that in the agreement that, we're going to be mindful of the timeline. Mindful of the timeline? What does that mean exactly? Here's the date, here's the structure, we need to have it by this time. So you can imagine how, where there's a high need for clarity, a high need for ironing out all the details, specifying, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, in negotiations with those from a different culture where that's not so necessary. It's just kind of a, hey, let's just hang with it, see what happens, kind of an entrepreneurial sort of, we don't need to know all the details. We can kind of make it up as we go along. You can see how the lack of structure could feel threatening to someone who really needs structure. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, from a leadership perspective, that empowerment as a management philosophy or approach, not surprisingly, is also not as desirable in cultures that prefer to avoid uncertainty. Tell me what you want, by when, with what specifications, and I'll give you that. So this is another important dimension that certainly shows itself in negotiation. You might have noticed, for example, in the US, there's this over-reliance on things like quarterly numbers, right? Here's how, we know that we are going to make our numbers, we're going to make stockholders happy, stakeholders, etc., right? And the idea of live for the day, be on time for these short-term milestones. And even the way that we plan, we may be thinking what new products we're going to bring out over the next year or two, whereas I've heard in Japan and China, there are strategic planning processes that identify what's going to be happening in the next 100 years or more. Because of this difference, there's some evidence that in China, for example, because we may be at this in this business for a long time, we have to really pay attention to saving money, doing things carefully to be resilient and persevere. Employees in cultures with long-term orientations are likely to stay with that employer for many years, barring COVID or other significant shifts in the worldwide economy. Although having said that, I remember time that I spent about a week or so in India. I found it really interesting that my daughter and I were in a very unbusy restaurant, and there were about 4 employees practically watching us eat. And one was the host, one was the waiter, one was the busboy, one was the manager, and it was almost as if they were overemployed, with having all these people that they didn't need. And I asked somebody at the time, not in that restaurant, but I asked somebody else, and it was kind of like, well, this is the kind of thing that even if there is, some challenge to the organization's financial viability in the US, there would be a layoff, end of story, no worries. But in other countries, let's see what we can do to keep people employed. We have this responsibility to them. Let's, that kind of thing. So this is a way of ensuring that employees remain with their employer for many years, that loyalty really exists. I've kind of mentioned some of these impacts already, and I know I've been talking for a while. So you can see how these dimensions and how members from these various cultures will behave in a negotiation. It's important to kind of get a sense of what this looks like, what to expect. Again, allowing for the possibility that not every person from Greece or Guatemala or Italy or Germany looks the same, acts the same. Depends on where they have spent their time in the workplace, what exposure they've had, what travel they have done. So, give some thought to this, and especially give some thought to this in the current case, the floundering expatriate, but also as your career unfolds. So, the countries that are represented in this case are listed there, and as I mentioned, give some thought to where they fall. Why is Bert flailing? Why is Bert not gaining more insight, looking for improvements that he could make? Where's his self-awareness, and why is it not working? So give that some thought. Other cultural impacts to consider beyond the Hofstede dimensions are the importance of the relationship, and we mentioned that a little bit before. The use of time. Now, time has a few dimensions here. One is how on time are we in certain cultures and subcultures? When a meeting starts at noon, does it start at noon, or does it start más o menos? Is it 20 minutes late, 10 minutes late? Perhaps a business meeting is a little bit less clear in the signal about time, but imagine a dinner, amongst friends. how likely are you to come on time or not? When is an event supposed to end? Is it as listed or is it more or less? And also, time we look at in the way in which we discuss various issues within a negotiation. So, monochronic time is the term that we use to describe when issues are followed in a linear fashion. First, number one, and when we finish and come to closure, then we talk about issue number two. And then when we finish that, and somebody from that kind of a culture, a monochronic culture, would find somebody from France, for example, where polychronic culture is far more common, which means any issue that's talked about can be talked about in any order, can be returned to, always fair game. In fact, we can kind of combine issues. So this gestalt, or this kind of like throw everything against the wall and see what sticks and resticks and resticks, this is polychronic. So to a German or an American that tends to follow monochronic time, somebody from a polychronic culture and who actually acts that way would look like chaos. Doesn't this person know that we need to get through these one at a time, and if we've already discussed something, it's done and dusted? So you can imagine how that could get in the way of a negotiation. Then there are also these other protocols like laws. I may have mentioned in class already that different countries have different rules of law that make, for example, bribery, which is illegal in many Western countries, look like standard operating procedure in another country. I'll leave that right there. But know that laws are not global and there is cultural relativity. So what is okay and what is not? Here's another law, quote unquote. In many cultures, the idea of marrying a relative, okay, maybe not a sister, but a first or second cousin, is a taboo. And in other cultures, that is the proper way to marry, again, not a sibling, but a cousin, as it is believed you maintain the bloodline. And I won't, again, get into more details about that, but you can reflect on your experience and see what I mean about that. Other protocols around eating together, like do we, and when we do, how do we? I invite you to look at the HSBC clip that I offer up in a few slides from now, how not only whether we eat together and how we eat together and what customs we kind of employ when we do that, but how expectations of even the nonverbal signal of finishing your plate or not finishing your plate, what that connotes to a different person from a different culture. Not so much in the US, but in other cultures, gift giving is an important part of negotiating. It's often presented first, and it could be from a small token to something larger that says, I want to welcome you to my country, I respect you, I want to demonstrate to you my generosity and my appreciation for us entering into this relationship. And in the US, for example, not only is gift giving not as common, but it often runs into problems when people represent governmental organizations that have strict requirements around not accepting gifts or not accepting gifts with values greater than $25, $50. And so you can again imagine how being presented with a beautiful small enamel painting from your Vietnamese counterpart, only to say, thank you very much, but here, I can't take this. So, again, this topic, gift giving, is not as common in the US, but it is potentially rife with all sorts of misunderstandings. And as you read in the text, what could actually ends the negotiation completely. So keep an eye on those issues as well. So even though we've been talking about contracts and cultural missteps and all that, in almost every culture, what remains as the base of the negotiation, and probably the most important factor, is the relationship. How do we establish a collaborative environment? How do we try to level the playing field even when there is a power difference? And so as you take on these different dimensions and recognize the built-in conflicts that cross-cultural negotiation presents, recognize that you and they are similarly challenged to understand, to appreciate, to adapt, and to not react negatively to something that somebody may have did or said but didn't mean it. And if you need to, be prepared to present your case of why this is important or why what you're doing it makes sense for you, because this too is really critical in building that relationship. So take some time to pause on this slide and click on the first and third clips that would provide a very interesting and illustrative example or two about how different cultures can clash. Now, not all of these are negotiations. In fact, probably none is directly, although the first is kind of the initial pitch that a U.S. organization makes to a Japanese organization for potential investment. They are, in all three cases, pretty exaggerated, I'll be honest, but they're fun to watch, and there are lessons to be learned. And I don't have a YouTube clip for the one in the middle, but this is a recent, not so hot quality, because I used my cell phone, example of the American-French clash. So take a listen, make the time to do that. I would encourage you to do so.
Class, but je parle
I think this slide is fairly self-explanatory. It summarizes a number of things I've already mentioned, and it provides kind of a, I don't want to say a simple checklist, but it certainly provides you with a way of thinking about communication in particular and how you prepare for, speak during, and comport yourself in order to be understood and understand others in a cross-cultural negotiation. And I think nowhere is, I think one that stands out for me at least is number 4. And I think I may have mentioned before how I was teaching in Vietnam, and in illustrating a particular point, I used what I thought was a funny example. And because of the delay with the simultaneous translation, I thought for a moment that I not only bombed, i.e. they didn't get my humor, but I thought I might have offended. Now, thankfully, after what felt like an unbelievable delay, there was some laughter. And, note to self from that moment was, I think I'll just avoid humor. So again, take a look at these and see if you can find some value in recognizing and being mindful and self-aware when engaging in these kinds of cross-cultural conversations. So one thing that often comes up in class is, okay, so what you're saying is, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? No. And this is kind of hard to explain in just a few words, but let me put it this way. If you, let's say, are negotiating in a Muslim country and there is a planned break where members of the Muslim faith were to take a break and do one of their prayers, usually it's 5 times a day, you may be tempted to say, oh, how about I pray with you? Not spoken, but thought, to show my solidarity with you. Yeah, that probably wouldn't go over that well. It's one thing to respect and be aware of. It's another to demonstrate that you are respectful, but you're not trying to be like the other person. So it could, in the extreme, look like mimicking, and that's exceptionally disrespectful. So when in Rome, if you're not Roman, understand Italian culture. Be prepared for some of the things that we talked about. Be prepared also that those with whom you're meeting may or may not represent the research that you've done just as much as you may or may not represent your country. So just because you come from a particular country, no guarantees that you will behave in ways that are consistent with that country. So be respectful, be sensitive, do your homework before, and expect that humans are full of surprises. As much as preparation is necessary to be effective when culture isn't an issue, you can imagine how much more critical preparation is in these cross-cultural negotiations. So knowing what you want and why you want it, etc., that still is the case. But in addition, spend time reading, prepping, talking to others who come from the countries or cultures that are represented. Invest that time. And in fact, ideally, and as mentioned in the text as well, don't show up Sunday night for a Monday morning negotiation in a country halfway around the world. That would not only disadvantage you in terms of jet lag, but also you're not giving yourself a chance to kind of feel the culture. You can read about it all you want, but how it plays out, even to the simplest of details, like, for example, in another culture, you may pay for your product and put your hand out after you hand the person a larger bill, put your hand out waiting for the change. Places that I've traveled to, that would be rude. There is a little dish, and when they finish counting out the change, they'll put the money in the dish and you'll grab it. Now, that's not kind of a, massive negotiation between two companies, but certainly it's something that could cause others to think of you as disrespectful, not well-versed in culture. So taking the time to prepare is critical. I think it comes down to these 3 key practices. When you get there, hopefully a few days before, observe. I don't need to repeat the questions that are on this chart. You can pause and read them. Listen. Do people speak differently, whether they're older, younger, male, female, dressed formally, dressed informally? How much do they interrupt one another? And is interruption rude, or is interruption the normal way of interacting? These are things you need to observe and listen and pay attention. And then if you find yourself making a mistake, you can ask the question and offer up that, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. Can you say more about this? It's okay that you make a mistake. What's not okay is being defensive or kind of being indirect about, oh, ha, 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 you did that. That message from your laughter may not be understood in the way that you intend. So observe, listen, ask questions, and which is kind of embodied by this, go there. Don't just try to learn about other cultures by reading about it. Spend time abroad. I think a number of these I've mentioned before, but the second one I haven't. So the temptation would be that where, of course, you're negotiating in a place where your language is not the official language, it would be a good idea to employ an interpreter. You should know that interpreters might do more than interpret. They might not only interpret the words spoken, but also the 93% of communication that is not the words spoken. Where I would make a point here is notice too that an interpreter might not be employed if you're going to London or if you're going to Sydney. That could be a mistake. While the languages are similar, they're not the same. So again, something you might think about. I talk about this in the article that I cited. Be interested as well as interesting. We, I think, know what interesting means, right? Share interesting stories, let people get to know you, but don't make it all about you. If you spend your time building the relationship talking about you and not showing yourself to be interested in them, you won't learn as much. You'll make more mistakes. So kind of balance the two. Disclose and let them know you, but also ask questions and demonstrate your interest in them. It's a good idea to not only find the positive in other approaches, but if you notice that your approach or where you fall on some of these dimensions is very different from where people from another culture fall, it would be a good idea to establish some expectations and manage them, and perhaps even share your apology when you've made a mistake, or let somebody else know, hey, where I come from, we have dinner first before we meet, or where I come from, right? So these are some steps that you can take in adapting and being seen as a global negotiator and not just somebody from the culture that you represent. Finally, take the time to reflect, after a negotiation, after a first dinner, after drinks with your cross-cultural counterparts, to really learn. Take on board your observations. Perhaps others will be kind enough to offer you specific feedback. Take that on board, re-educate yourself. It will only pay dividends in the future. And finally, here are a few books that I would recommend, especially the bottom two. These are specifically around this topic of cross-cultural negotiation. So if you have one coming up, I would encourage you to arm yourself with the best resources that you can find.